Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. So, as usual, I have too many slides, so I'm going to try to breeze through this and then ask me questions when things just pop up. So I'm going to tell you a little bit first about myself and how I came into working in these fields, which are human-robot interaction and social robotics. So I'm actually a social scientist by training. I have a degree in political science and in science and technology studies. And so this doesn't necessarily immediately translate in people's mind into robots. But the way that I got into it was actually through an interest in studying the scientists themselves. So I wanted to see, I had heard about this thing called social robotics, which seemed like an oxymoron. And I wanted to see how do actually scientists or technologists try to build, how do they understand sociality, how do they try to build machines that are supposed to be social. So this is me from more than something like 10 years ago, actually observing researchers at Carnegie Mellon making robotic technologies. And one thing that I noticed when I was talking to researchers and kind of looking at what they're doing is that along with designing technologies, which is their job, they're also designing kind of visions of what the world is going to be like, what social interactions are going to be like, what we might be or should be doing around these technologies at the same time. So I actually found out that as a social scientist there was quite a lot of stuff that you can do in robotics. And also that robotics researchers are actually quite open to interacting with and collaborating with social scientists. So much like Margaret, I'm actually I really like to collaborate with people who are technologists, and a lot of my work is based on that. So the thing that motivates my work these days is actually this notion that's all over the news, so you've probably heard it, and is also all over the research community, which is that very soon we are supposed to be having robots in every home. So this is a depiction by Bill Gates from his Scientific American article in 2007, where you kind of see, robots, things we already have, like the Roomba, or the robot folding towels, or the robot taking care of the older adult right there. And so this is kind of the vision that people are striving for these days. And you can also see that in kind of governmental work that they're actually funding these kinds of things. So the NSF for the past few years has had this call for developing co-robots. So robots that work beside and collaborate cooperatively with people in direct support of and in symbiotic relationship with human partners. And as you can imagine, these are the kinds of things that can't be answered from a technological perspective alone. A lot of these things that they're mentioning, cooperation, symbiosis, even this notion of how do robots actually fit into our homes, what are they doing there, are things that also involve a lot of social questions, a lot of sociological, psychological, even anthropological research. So my role in this kind of stuff is there. What I'm interested in is figuring out and trying to understand how cultural and social factors play a role in robotics. And thankfully this is a very open field, so I do it in a lot of different ways. And I'm going to just quickly tell you a little bit about how we do it on different levels. So some of it has to do with doing research on designing robots or studying how people interact with robots that are inspired by theories from social science. Some of them had to do with field research of how people actually use robots in real life. We also kind of try to design robots, so we take our understanding of how people interact with these things, or our observations of what people do with robots, and try to create new designs. And more recently, we've also become more and more interested in actually trying to get not only social scientists, but actually users, the people who are supposed to be interacting with these things, more involved, because we think that's really important. So this is my lab. It's in a house. It's called the R house, which gets very confusing when you're actually talking to somebody and saying, well, why don't you come to our house? And then they're like, your house, this house, and so this is just a picture. We bring people there sometimes to do experimental studies with them. So this is some people interacting with some of the robots in there. We've also been doing research in both, I started with this in Japan many years ago in 2005, but also with people in local nursing homes interacting with socially assistive robots, which are kind of a new form of robot. Often older adults are the target population for these kinds of things, and this is a robot we work with called Paro. It's a robotic seal, and it's meant to replicate pet therapy, or the effect of pets that animals might have on people, so make people more emotionally feel better. And let's see if this works. So this is just a video I just wanted to bring it to you. We don't have videos from the local nursing home because IRB doesn't, we don't have IRB for that, but this is just a video of older adults in Japan interacting with Paro, the seal. And so there's been a lot of research on Paro since Paro was a project started 20 years ago, so that's why finally it's actually become a product. But there's a lot of research testing its effects, so they found that people their mood improves, that they maybe even start socializing with each other, but there's not a lot of research on how those effects actually come into being. So that's what we're actually interested in, trying to figure out how the kind of social surroundings of Paro support its successful use. And that's what we've been doing in the local nursing homes. So we look at some of the ways that social mediation plays into the successful use of Paro, how therapists kind of support its use, how other people in the environment support its use. We look at kind of indirect as well as direct effects, because we've noticed that it's not just the person interacting with the robot, but people around that actually get more kind of interested or have more, get more engaged. Not just with the robot. And we've also been kind of interested in how different individuals and different organizations interpret the robot. So going off from Paro, just an example, and some of you have actually used this thing. So we've also kind of been worked for a while to design and develop our own robots. And similarly to Margaret, we actually use these Arduinos to build them, because there's been it's very exciting that with kind of hobbyist platforms and technologies that are more open to more people, you can actually bring something like robotics to a social science lab. And so we've been developing kind of different kinds of robots. This one was a way to test brake management and kind of looking at different ways what the robot does or how it looks and how it affects what people think of it. I'm just going to skip that. Here's another one which a student of mine designed, and he just finished his qual today, which is really exciting. Which is a face robot that we're using to kind of study people's, how people read emotion here and also in Japan. And this one is actually also at the same, yeah. It's at the Waldron. It's at the Waldron Exhibit. So funny how small the world is. And we've also, as I mentioned, been really interested, aside from kind of doing our own research about robots in the field or designing our robots and testing some of our ideas about what might be interesting. We've also been working with users to see what users think are the directions that people should be going in terms of designing robots. Because in the end, really, that's what's important. Those are the people who are going to be most affected by these kinds of technologies. So with some of my students, particularly here in Lee, who's been doing a lot of this interviewing in Korea, we've been looking at how Korean users, South Korean users, and US users think about technology, and these are some user designs, basically, that they themselves drew about what they think robots will be doing and how they're going to look. And we found some patterns, basically, such as the South Korean participants often talked about kind of more relational, robots as more relational technologies. In the US, people talked about them as kind of being more functional, that's more important. And we've also found that people really focus not just on the technology, but what their social experiences are like, and what their relationships are like, what the hierarchies in those spaces are like, and how the technology will actually fit into those. And so we've been thinking about the idea that you can make technologies that can reproduce those relationships, or you can actually make them to potentially kind of question them. So particularly in South Korea, they found that there's a lot of very gendered use of technology and of space, which then kind of gets translated into what the robots are expected to do. So we're going to continue in this And we're actually working with Jen also on more participatory design of robots with older adults, because there's so much discussion of how older adults need robots. This is going to be something that's going to solve problems for them, solve problems in caregiving, but there's really not enough of a discussion with older adults themselves or with caregivers about what kind of role they want those technologies to have. So that's it for me. I hope that wasn't too long or boring. But if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer. Yes?
Do the caregivers have different opinions from the primary care recipients?
Sometimes they do. So with this particular one, we just started. So it's actually with some funding from Forfeit. So we have some seed funding to start this, so we don't have results about the participatory stuff. But I've talked to caregivers before, and yes, sometimes there's the understanding that the robot may actually kind of help the caregivers kind of get more time to do certain tasks while the person is involved with the robot. But the reason the person wants to be involved with the robot has nothing to do with that. So the person might just be entertained. Or actually we've found that sometimes the users, the older adults will actually use the robot in order to get attention from other people. So it's not really that they're interested in interacting with the robot, but the robot is kind of a lure for others to come and chat with them. So because we've been basically kind of sitting, one of the students has been kind of sitting and observing what people are doing. The robot is just sitting there and she observes, and so one of the things that she's observed is that there will be people who are totally uninterested in the robot unless there's somebody else around, and then they're like, oh, Paro, you're so lovely, and then, and then the other person gets sucked into the interaction too, so yeah. Yeah.
On your comparison of US versus South Korea, in South Korea, I'm assuming they've already heard of Paro, that it's much more open and available. And how much does that awareness of Paro affect the results that you're seeing?
So
whereas here, I would say it's the Jetsons.
Right. So I think a lot of the vision of what robots are, I mean, that's another ulterior motive that I have, is actually trying to figure out with as many people as possible what could be a richer vision of what robots might do, because I think we're all influenced by these more science fiction ideas of the Jetsons and all these other things, but we don't really understand the kind of underlying social dynamics around us as well, so we're not thinking about technology in that way. I mean, some of it is kind of influenced by those notions, but a lot of it, if you actually talk to people, so that those studies were done with people in their homes, and if you talk with them about stuff in their homes, they actually really start discussing it through the lens of what's going on in their home. And that's partly why we did it in the home, is so that they would have that context rather than the kind of very abstract, like, oh, what does the future look like? Oh, maybe it looks like the Jetsons. So that they would first start thinking about, I'm here, this is what my daily life is like, and then start thinking about the technology within that frame. So it's had some effect, but that's not kind of, I wouldn't say that's necessarily the defining characteristic in the end.
Except for that, where our brains go when we do brainstorming internally, uncontrolled or controlled, is always affected by the images we have from outside and the images we've seen.
Definitely.
And so that sense of any sort of warm fuzziness that's associated in South Korea, I can't help but think that it's affected by the awareness of Paro. And here we have, even the closest thing we have besides Roomba is those little puppies and stuff that go bark bark or whatever, or what's the one that's sitting on my shelf that my kids have? The little fuzzy one that, used
Furby?
to yeah, them. And those are all sort of in that modern, more toned down, less fuzzy vein. And irritating too, so.
Furby is very irritating, you're right.
Fuzzy and modern.
So we actually I think there needs to be more research on that, because there are a lot of assumptions about how those kinds of things affect people, but actually there's very little research about how, for example, media exposure affects people. And I think the more research that's been done, it's not quite so clear. So we even did a survey more recently that compared, it was a very long one, that compared how people in US, South Korea, and Turkey kind of think about robots, how they evaluate different robots. And we were particularly interested in seeing like if their familiarity with certain kinds of robots in the media was in some way correlated with their opinions, and it turned out that didn't work quite so well. I mean, of course, we didn't have a representative sample. Maybe if we had more people in the survey, things could have been different. Maybe if we could structure the survey differently, things could have been different. But I think that there are other. I think the popular media are very much in our minds, and I think they're very often talked about like in the media themselves when they talk about like, yes, Japan should love robots because they have all these fuzzy robots. But social scientists have actually studied Japan quite a bit in robotics, and one of the things that they found is, yes, there's a lot of media stuff about robots, but there's actually a lot of government activity in terms of presenting robots as something that's cool and acceptable. And so it's not just the media, but there's a lot of other stuff that's kind of playing into it. Any other?
Well, just sort of a comment on this. I don't know how many people saw the movie Robot and Frank that came out. I actually didn't see it, but I saw a lot of the trailers and so forth and was kind of intrigued by the whole idea and was sort of surprised that it didn't get really much reaction, even because it's presenting this not too distant future when an aging person is being taken care of by a robot, which is in this, and it just seemed to have sunk like a stone. Like it's just not even a conversation that we're having in this country.
Maybe it was too indie of a movie.
Yeah, maybe. And I was surprised by that, just given the hold the Jetsons has on all our imaginations and the fact that robots really are already here. That we're not even talking about, maybe because we don't like to think about getting older in this country. Baby boomers don't like to think about
denial.
Getting older. Yes, whereas in Korea and in a lot of Asian countries, the older generation is much more venerated. And anyway, so there might be that element at
But
work here
still,
too.
across, even in Japan, for example, where you have this more venerated position, robots are being suggested as this kind of technological fix for population distribution issues.
Right.
Right.
Which is why maybe the government is more active.
Yeah, but I agree. There definitely isn't enough discussion about that. There's some discussion from the point of ethicists or social scientists, but in the media or among people, there definitely isn't enough. And even in the design of these things, there isn't enough of that discussion. So one would hope that there would be more, and that's kind of part of why we want to do more participatory design, is because we'd like to have that conversation with people who stand to be directly affected.
Right.
I was wondering how long robots like Paro are effective. Like, does the novelty wear off and then people aren't really interested in it anymore? And like for the things on the shelf somewhere, like how long do you expect people to keep that?
Yeah, so one of the big problems of robotics research is always something they call the novelty effect, which is basically when you bring a person into your lab and you have them interact with a robot, and it's for 10 minutes or an hour or maybe for a week, even a week. You get that first moment of interest, and then you don't really know what's going to happen for a month. But so Paro, I think, has been particularly interesting because it's been used for more than 10 years in one particular place in Japan, for example. And it's like one of the only technologies like this that have longitudinal studies about it. And my argument in terms of how that works is that it's really not just about the robot, but it's about having a kind of social organization that makes sense of the robot in a way where it actually has this kind of more long-lasting function. So what we've seen happen in the nursing home here, and what also happened in Japan, is that basically the nurses or the therapist or somebody found a way where Paro kind of fit a niche in the organization. So interestingly, in the Japanese one, for example, they found that if they used Paro with certain patients, they could actually have them take less medication. And the government there supports the decrease in the use of medication, interestingly. So actually Paro kind of fit one of their goals. Or they found that they could get people to wander less if they had them interact with Paro. Or in the local nursing home, they found that people who might be having kind of problems with sometimes aggression or sometimes just agitation, if they had them interact with Paro one-on-one, they could kind of lessen some of that. So as long as people can find this kind of niche within the space, there can be long-term use, but it's really dependent on having this kind of social support. Otherwise, yeah, Paro can end up in the closet too.
Thanks, Selma.
Yeah, thank you very much.